Please be seated. Okay, y'all can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to preach on the fact that none of you can become a disciple of Christ unless you give up all your possessions. Though I will reference that at the end of my sermon, I'll give you that. I'm also not going to touch Philemon and the difficult bit of theology that St. Paul has interjected into Scripture by returning a runaway slave to his former masters. We're not going to get in there either. I'm actually not going to be speaking much about the lessons. I've been invited to come and preach to you today about some work that I've been doing with others around the diocese. As the bulletin says, my name is Mark Smith, and I'm a deacon in the diocese. And I'm thrilled to be here to preach today in the context of work that Anoma and I and others have been doing over the past 4 years or so. This is work of seeking to establish relationships with Native peoples on behalf of our diocese. Relationships with peoples in the lands that we now refer to as Eastern Massachusetts, the lands on which we live and worship. We want to do what little we can as a church to repair the harm done by 400 years of displacement and enslavement and genocide at the hands of settler colonialism. Harm for which the church bears a great deal of responsibility. And we are starting on this long road of repair by developing relationships. These new relationships our working group seeks to establish are to be led by Native people's experience, not our guilt or shame or desire to be good, but led by Native people's experience and wisdom and their goals and dreams for themselves. And the intent of this relational work is to become allies in the efforts of Native people to protect and in some cases to reestablish their cultures and their rights and their very dignity. Now, what this relationship building work looks like is pretty mundane. We read, we talk, we email, we call, we show up. It began with a conversation with one young Wampanoag man, and he talked and we listened, and at the end of our conversation, we asked if there were contacts from other tribes that he would recommend. We followed up on those leads, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as you can imagine, the work has been slow. We haven't kept count of all of the unanswered phone calls and emails, but we were not surprised. I mean, after centuries of oppression justified by the doctrine of discovery, it's not a surprise that our calls aren't immediately answered when we say we're calling from the church. Sorry, my tablet is being really rude today. There we go. Sorry. All right. No tab. So in the course of this work, I'm going off script now. But over the course of this work, one of the things that has become clear to me is how important this work is to my own spiritual development, my individual formation as a disciple of Christ. For one thing, I need to accept the fact that in this work, I know nothing. I need to be humble enough to recognize that I am not the expert, I know nothing. I need to let go of the privilege and the prestige that comes with my education and my gender and my race, and be able to come into these conversations asking, inquiring, being open and humble. And that spirit of humility is an important place for me to be as a Christian. It's good work. I've also been impressed by the ways in which my mind has been opened by new perspectives on the world, new non-colonial, non-imperial perspectives on the world. For instance, Native people see creation as a being to be prayed to be lived with, and to be cared for, not as a thing to be consumed and exploited for my sake. This is a lesson that St. Francis tried to teach the church in the 13th century, isn't it? In his Ode to Creation, his singing to our brother sun, our sister moon, our mother earth, who cares for us. We didn't really learn that lesson in the 13th century, but perhaps following the lead of our native neighbors, the church might be able to begin to learn that lesson now. It's also quite common in native communities that when they gather to meet and discern, they gather in a circle. All voices are listened to. All perspectives are shared as the community leans into that circle to discern what is the ultimate truth they're seeking. Imagine how different our church would be if we gathered in circles and not in this configuration. Now, I'll admit the diocesan convention would be a pretty big circle, but I think most vestry meetings organize themselves oblong anyway. But imagine if there were no head to the circle, but simply a circle. I feel like that's the way that Jesus met with people. Whenever I imagine him gathering with his disciples, I imagine him sitting in a circle on the grass with them. Don't know if that's true, but that's the spirit that I get from him. The other thing that I've learned from working with Native people is the way in which their perspective, their view, their goal in life is, what can I do to make it better for 7 generations ahead of me? And the notion that I am a part of this community, not the head of it. That my goal is not to strive for my own success, but for the protection and preservation of the community. Again, that feels like a very Christ-like way of being. Living for the sake of the common good and for the sake of generations to come, and not for my own self-satisfaction. As I said, this work that we've been doing started with one conversation, led to another, led to another. One of those threads led us eventually to a meeting with Carolyn Haskell at St. Paul's in Natick. We had a dinner meeting with Carolyn and some of her family. Carolyn Haskell is a member of St. Paul's in Natick, St. Paul's Episcopal Church. She and her family are stalwarts of the congregation, have been for multiple generations. She also happens to be the head of the Bear Clan of the Natick Nipmuc. And at that dinner, one of the subjects that came up, not surprisingly, was the expulsion of Natick people to Deer Island during Metacomet's rebellion or King Philip's War. See, Natick was originally set up as a praying town, a place where so-called friendly Indians would move to, and they would agree to adopt English ways of dress, English ways of farming, of living, English customs, in exchange for being allowed to stay on that land, in the area that had been their ancestral land. This happens to be the 350th anniversary of the beginning of King Philip's War, Metacomet's resistance. And during the early months of that encounter, that war, the colonists, the colonial government in Boston, got very anxious about having all of these native people living in close proximity in these lands. And so on the one night in October of 1675, the colonial government came, rounded up the Nipmucs and others in Natick, marched them out to Deer Island in the harbor, in the Boston harbor, and left them there over the winter. Left them there without provisions, without shelter. About 1,000 native people were taken out there. About a half of them died over the winter of starvation or exposure to the elements. And many of the others that survived that ordeal were sold into slavery in the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations. Again, these were the friendly Indians, the Indians that agreed to accommodate, to assimilate to the English ways of being. These were the Indians that were gathered up and imprisoned. So in that dinner, the subject came up, and the reality that this year was the 350th anniversary. And one of the Nipmucs said, "It's too bad that we can't use this upcoming anniversary to raise awareness of this atrocity and the history of Deer Island." And as one of them said, "I want people to know that this happened to us, and I want people to know we are still here." Well, one thing has led to another, and so in October this year, on Indigenous Peoples Day, October 13th, the Diocese of Massachusetts is partnering with the Diocese of Western Massachusetts, and we will gather at St. Paul's in Natick and take a sacred journey by bus, easy. By bus, we will go from Natick out to Deer Island, and on Deer Island, a group of Natick Nipmucs will lead us in a sacred gathering of remembrance for what has happened, in remembrance of their ancestors, and a commitment to never forget. I hope that some of you can join us on that sacred journey. We're also sponsoring a online seminar in September, September 23rd. It's on Zoom. It's a Tuesday evening, I believe. And a seminar on an introduction to King Philip's War, Metacomet's resistance. It's a critical piece of our history, particularly in this area, and it's a piece of history that isn't taught much anymore, and many people are completely unaware of. That seminar will be led by Don Brown, who is the Pokanoket tribal historian. And then on the day before that commemoration, or on the day before the Deer Island trip, we will be having a Zoom service of Holy Listing. So that's October 12th, where we will be listening to the stories of several Native people and the stories of their, the harm and resistance that is their story, particularly in relation to the memory of Metacomet's resistance. So there's a range of opportunities and ways to commemorate this anniversary, including in accepting the bishop's invitation to mark Sunday, October 12th in your liturgy as a service of remembrance and lamentation. And I know that your clergy have some liturgical resources to consider in that as well. So I hope that you all will consider joining us in those. What our working group's goal, vision, dream is to cultivate a movement of congregations across the diocese, each working to develop their own relationships with Native people native to the lands on which they sit and worship. So I look forward to exploring the possibilities of All Saints being one of those parishes in this movement. Finally, I'll say that I feel blessed to do this work, and as I said, blessed with and challenged with the invitation to walk through this work with humility. Again, needing to accept unanswered phone calls, and frankly, needing to being willing to being on the receiving end of 400 years of rage, which is understandable. I said I would make reference to the lessons at the end, and I had a much more eloquent way of getting there, but I don't remember what it was. But I will just say this. A lot of this work is about the church giving up our own assumptions of entitlement, our own assumptions of our virtue, giving up our desire, our impulse to forget what happened long ago because we weren't responsible, and being willing to walk with dignity into places from privilege into pain, with the hopes of moving from that pain into restoration. Amen.